Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, repealing the pension tax and increasing the earned income tax credit. Those are the big financial headlines from Governor Whitmer's State of the State address this past week. So what does that mean for your pocketbook? And is everyone across the board going to benefit if the governor gets her way? The short answer, no. We'll explain that. Tonight we'll go behind the headlines and add it all up with two people who work in the front lines of fiscal policy and economic analysis. But first, we have viewer feedback from last week's show here on the follow-up, where we focused on school choice. In an email, Wayne from Bay City wrote this, quote, "It was good to see a half hour of airtime being devoted to the most critically important factor facing our state, the education of our state's children, the foundation of our state's future," end quote. Well, thanks, Wayne, for your email, and thanks for tuning into the follow-up. And we would like to hear from more of you to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media and on Facebook and Twitter. You can email us, as Wayne just did, and you can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows this past season, just log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Now for tonight's show, two veterans of the follow-up. We have James Hohman. He is the Director of Fiscal Policy for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy out of the Midland. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And I've got Chris Douglas with me as well, economics professor from the University of Michigan, Flint. Like I said, a couple of regulars, and we're glad to have you back.
It's great to be back, Mike.
So before we dive deep into this conversation, kind of doing some analysis on Governor Whitmer's State of the State address, let's take a look at some of those big rocks. And let's start with sort of the rollback of the retirement tax, or the pension tax, another way that they call it, for some seniors saving 500,000 households on average of $1,000 a year. These are her numbers. Expand the working families tax credit, also known as the earned income tax credit, delivering an average refund of $3,000 a year for 700,000 families. And then expand the Great Start Readiness Program, as she calls it, to provide all 4-year-olds access to free public preschool education, saving families on average $10,000 a year. So let's take them one at a time, gentlemen. Let's start with the repealing of the pension tax for some retirees. Some retirees on a fixed income, that seems like that might make sense for them, save them some dollars. Not every retiree will benefit. So Chris, let me just start with you. What do you make of that?
So I think there are a couple of issues to keep in mind. First, the $9 billion surplus, although I guess it's $8 billion now, given the governor signed a $1 billion spending bill while I was in class this evening. This is one-time money, thanks to the COVID dollars of the American Rescue Plan, which the federal government just printed out of thin air to give states, which is why we have inflation right now. But every state got $250 billion. So this is Michigan's share. These spending plans you're talking about, like repealing the pension tax, preschool, I think it is, earned income tax credit, these are ongoing expenses. So it's tough to finance ongoing expenses on a permanent basis with one-time dollars, because eventually those one-time dollars are going to run out. So if you talk about repealing the pension tax, you have to ask the question, why should seniors get tax relief no one else is getting?
I know our retirees watching are going, wait a minute, I don't like that answer. So why don't you follow up with that?
Well, so I'm with Chris on this, but
right.
I've got a little bit of a different take on it. So I recognize why lawmakers in Michigan, just like lawmakers in other states, want to give tax preferences to seniors. Like we have them, a lot of other states have them. And when lawmakers in 2011 moved from pension exemptions to the senior deduction available for all seniors, a lot of people found that they were going to pay higher taxes. And so lawmakers pledged to repeal the pension tax. And now that our new Democratic majorities are in there, that's one of their first priorities. But they should reconsider, because their proposal gives, so not just for the people who found themselves paying a higher tax bill after they already made the decision to opt out of the labor force, it also gives it to seniors going forward. And lawmakers shouldn't care about whether seniors get pension income or retiring on 401ks, but this only gives preferences to pension income. And so I'd love to see them revisit that, especially because right now, the pension exemptions that they're talking about, it's unlimited pensions for all government retirees and pretty substantial ones for private sector workers, but for the largest, I mean, this is the Democrats' largest priorities, and the biggest beneficiary of this is the person who's receiving the highest government pension, and that's John Engler. And I don't think they intended to give John Engler a massive tax cut.
I'm guessing not. And
no, I don't think he's a Michigan resident, though, so maybe not.
Not anymore. I think he's actually in Virginia. But and just to follow up on this, I mean, repealing that, I think you guys touched on, really about a third of retirees would maybe benefit in terms, and then we think about income, and Chris, I think you and I have talked about this, many retirees have a sizable net worth, and some would say, do they really need a tax cut?
Right, so if you look at senior citizens as a whole, they have a lower poverty rate than the rest of the population. They have a much higher net worth than other generations. You can find estimates out there that say the typical senior is worth about 9 times in terms of net worth compared to what a millennial is. You do tracks in terms of where seniors were in their 30s compared to where people in their 30s are right now. Seniors were in a much better spot for pretty obvious reasons. Housing was a lot cheaper back then. College was cheaper back then. Seniors got to enjoy 50 years of pretty significant stock market returns. So you're talking about giving tax relief to a segment of a population that is doing largely better than the rest of the population. If you think about people who are drawing a pension, a defined benefit pension, that's a small slice of retirees. That's a benefit most people don't get right now. So I don't understand why you would take one-time dollars that are not going to refill every year and give permanent tax relief to the small sliver of a pretty well-off population. Eventually, that $9 billion is going to run out. Does the legislature revisit the pension tax again like in 2001? Or do they raise taxes on other people, cut spending?
I want to follow up on that because I think it's an important principle that I would love our lawmakers to have. I don't think they're going to get us until people start to think this too, and that's that we shouldn't give tax preferences to people who don't need it. Seniors, like Chris said, tend to be well off, but this is something that also goes into some of the governor's other priorities, where we're going to put a massive public, or going to add massive public expense, help a lot of people who are doing well that don't need government assistance.
That's a really good point to cap that part of the conversation and repealing the pension tax. So let's talk about this increase in the earned income tax credit. She's proposing from 6% to 30% retroactive to 2022. Again, another case of it really doesn't benefit everyone across the board. So what is your take on that?
All right, so what they're talking about is matching the federal credits. And federal credits, your eligibility is mostly based on 2 things: whether you have kids and your income levels. And despite having simple rules, a lot of the payments, 27% of all payments, go to people who don't meet eligibility requirements. They claim earned income tax credits on their taxes, and they're just not eligible for it. And only when they test them later, they're like, oops, sorry, you don't really apply. And that's a problem, because that means this proposal from 6% to 30% is going to lead to payments for people who aren't eligible of $100 million a year. That's a massive expense. And now, for the people who might just not know that they're supposed to qualify or not, it's not a good thing to make such a huge amount of beneficiaries violate their tax laws. They're going to be subject to penalties and all sorts of problems from the IRS from this. I think that's a good reason to say, look, federal government, you can do your own thing, but we're not going to add on to this in state. If lawmakers want to structure tax relief or redistribution to working families, you can do much better than the earned income tax credit.
You were talking about a significant amount of money too. I mean, ballpark, earned income tax credit at the federal level is worth about $5,500. So the state matches 6% of that, which is another $300 or so. She's talking about taking that up to 30%. So you do 30% of $5,000, you're talking about a few $1,000s. So that's a significant expenditure. And getting back to this idea that we have a one-time pot of funds, how are we going to meet this massive expenditure when that pot's run out? I think a good analogy is, you might remember the tobacco settlement agreement in the 1990s. Coincidentally, that's about a $250 pot of money divvied out to the states. Michigan got about $20 billion from it. And they used that to finance college scholarships. Well, eventually the money ran out, partly as a result of the 2001 recession, and the state was using the tobacco money to plug the budget holes. And the state just stopped giving out those college scholarships. Well, will the state stop giving out the 30% match of the federal earned income tax credit? Will the state stop the pension tax exemption? It's hard to imagine that happening because those were such politically heavy lifts back in 2011. Probably what the governor and the legislators are banking on is that it won't run out on their watch, right? That'll be a problem for the next governor, not this current governor. It's fun to spend money. It's not so fun not to spend money. Well, that'll be her successor's problem.
Yeah, it's interesting you point out. So a third of Michigan families can really take advantage if this goes through, this earned income tax credit, the increase, cost savings about $3,000 annually. And that's where some of the pushback is from the Republicans. It's not big enough, and they say it's just been phased in too slowly.
So I don't know if that's a great point on
Okay.
this, but I mean, it does go back to our point of you don't need to take care of people you don't need to take care of. And this eligibility extends to families earning $60,000 a year who probably don't need special credits to make it through. It's just a program that doesn't quite do what lawmakers think that it does. For instance, they think it helps people out of helps children come out of poverty, and it does for families who are in poverty. This covers a lot of people who are well above those rates. And on top of that, the other thing that lawmakers claim is that this encourages work, and that's true to an extent. But once you get up to maximum eligibility levels and start to earn more, you start to lose benefits, which means that your marginal tax rate, for every dollar you earn, you not only pay your 4.25% income taxes on, but you also lose benefits from this program. That is also a disincentive to work, and it's something that lawmakers should care a little bit more about.
You mentioned that 4.25%, so let's touch on that for a moment. Because of this sizable budget surplus, it would likely trigger a reduction of the state's personal income tax rate from 4.05% to 4.25%.
The other way.
Okay, gotcha. Let's flip that. That would be an across-the-board cut for every Michigan taxpayer. That's not something the governor mentioned in the State of the State, and that's concerning the Sun. So let me just be clear on that. It would reduce the state's personal income tax rate to 4.05% from 4.25%.
Yeah, so this is a result of the 2015 tax hikes that increased fuel taxes and registration taxes. And to make that a little more palatable, lawmakers then said, look, in the future we're going to lower taxes as long as revenues increase above inflation. Well, that's this year now, and revenues are increasing well above inflation. And so right now, based on these formulas, our administrators expect this is going to be an automatic tax reduction from, as you said, 4.25% to 4.05%. I think that lawmakers can afford this because revenue has been growing pretty substantially. But our governor's trying to fight it. She came up with this crazy proposal these days, which is, so it's based on fiscal revenue for the last fiscal year, which ended in September. That's 4 months ago. And she wants to say, well, all that revenue that came into the general fund, we want to reclassify now so that we can avoid that tax hike. And in fact, we want to spend that on selective business subsidies. I just don't think you can do it. Like, that doesn't seem like it, like we already recorded the revenue. It's already been there. We just need to finish closing the books and publish the financial statement. I don't think you can transfer money 4 months after it already happened.
No. Well, and unless the Constitution is changed, right? I mean, the governor really can't stop that from happening once it triggers it, right?
Well, it's a statute. If legislators wanted, they could get rid of that statute. That's perfectly within their powers. But to retroactively claim that revenue didn't go into the general fund when it was already recorded that way, I just don't know if it's possible.
So again, we touched on it earlier, sort of the backdrop to the governor's proposals is that the state's budget surplus is expected to be over $9 billion, as you guys mentioned. Maybe it's down to 8 right now, based on what she spent allocated today, which we'll get into. 4.1 billion in the school aid fund, the result of the record tax revenue we've had in the last couple of years. So, you know, we're flush with cash, and that's why the governor wants to spend a lot on that surplus on these proposals, which could cost $1 billion, right? I think you guys are thinking, show some restraint, be a little bit more conservative, save more of that for a rainy day, maybe give back a little bit to the taxpayers because of the tax revenue, but hang on a second here, right?
Yeah, I mean, so much of this is just one-time funding from COVID stimulus, most notably the American Rescue Plan that President Biden signed into law in March 2021, gave states and local governments $250 billion. You know, Michigan got a big chunk of change from that, and that's where a lot of this $9 billion is coming from. So I would say, when you have one-time money, you should be using that for one-time projects. You should try to match up the timing of revenues and expenditures. So we all know the roads in Michigan could be a lot better, and I think $9 billion would go a long way in knocking out some road projects. So I know the Michigan Department of Transportation is analyzing the feasibility of tolling various interstates. Tolling is complicated based on federal law, but the ballpark estimate I saw was that tolls, if you tolled every road that was eligible to be tolled, that'd bring in about $1.5 billion a year just in toll revenue. Should that happen? Should it not happen? I'm not opposed to tolls philosophically. Roads are good. People who use the good should pay for it. But if you have $9 billion, you could do the equivalent of 6 years worth of road projects based on toll revenue. So it's striking to me that there's absolutely no discussion in terms of taking this massive budget surplus and putting them towards some pretty critical infrastructure projects. Could be roads, could be water, could be other things that just need a one-time infusion of dollars to get these things back up to grade. And that discussion, as far as I can tell, is not happening.
So there's 2 points on the federal stimulus I think just worth mentioning because it drives me crazy. This is one reason why Congress is weird and I don't like it, which is that that $250 million that they gave to the states, it was supposed to meet immediate needs caused by COVID and to backfill revenue losses. Well, the state found that they didn't have a lot of immediate needs that weren't already met from previous stimulus efforts.
It's hard to believe, but keep going, right.
And the state didn't have any revenue losses. I think partially because of all the federal stimulus efforts, when the state's revenues really didn't take as big of a cut in fiscal year 2020 as they expected. And then the following year, we actually found that our revenue kept coming in faster and is still at these elevated levels. Now, it's expected to taper off for the next 2 years, but state taxes generate more revenue, and lawmakers, as Chris said, can use some of that extra money to fulfill budget priorities. I mean, it's ostensibly the governor's biggest priority to fix roads. I think she's revealed over the past 4 years it's not that big of a priority. She vetoed it in her first year, but she is now spending more state revenue on the roads, and I think she can do a lot to get us to the point where we're fixing roads faster than they fall apart, and do that without having to raise taxes.
It's so interesting you mentioned that because a lot of cities are struggling to find places to put their ARPA money, their American Rescue Plan money, which we're talking about here. It's still sitting on the shelf, not doing a heck of a lot of good. Some cities have spent it. Bay City, for instance, has, and they're fixing a lot of their infrastructure with their roads and their streets and their water. Others are still sitting on it. And just today, part of the show, the governor signed a $1.1 billion supplemental spending bill Tuesday that will send the federal COVID-19 relief funds across the state for business and housing programs. So the supplemental spending bill appropriates $240 million of that American Rescue Plan dollars. So it's exactly what you're talking about. Just now, they're starting to spend it. We're flush with cash, you know.
Well, they have allocated much of their stimulus money already. I don't know if it's already been spent, but they planned at least for the state budget. But for this one, it's crazy to me that their highest priorities is not doing things like Chris is talking about, but rather they're spending it on selective business subsidies. Now, this is just saying a company comes up to the state and says, hey, we've got a factory we want to locate, give us some extra money. And the state says, here you go, here's a couple of $100 million. Economists study these things and whether these selective subsidies work. Some of them find positive effects, most of them find negative effects, none of them find large effects. But when you hear lawmakers talk about this, you hear them sound like they're buying the future of Michigan's economy, and it just doesn't work. They're ineffective at creating jobs, they're unfair to the taxpayers who don't get them, and they're expensive to the state budget, and lawmakers should just stop writing these checks.
So these are all proposals at the moment, although she did sign this stimulus package, the supplemental spending today. She does have her disposal. The House and the Senate now are Democratic. It's a small majority, but do you think she's going to have sort of carte blanche to do whatever she wants, or do you think there's going to be some challenging there that she's not going to be able to do that as much?
I'm really not sure. I think it's kind of an unpredictable situation. They are slim minorities, and so I think they're slim minorities of a lot of new legislators who have different ideas about how to do things, who may or may not owe the governor anything yet. And so getting that kind of agreement in order to pass legislation might be hard, because there's a million reasons to say no to every piece of legislation, and maybe some of the Democratic coalition will find some of those reasons. I don't know. We're going to find out very soon.
Yeah, it's a swing minority with a lot of people in swing districts. So if you're in a district that is traditionally maybe R+2, R+3, and you won as a Democrat, you have to kind of think about the political calculus too. If I take this vote to put forward one of the governor's priorities, what are the people back home going to think? Am I going to be a 2-term legislator? Term limits were changed that allow me to stay in the House of Representatives 12 years. Well, 12 years sounds a lot better than 2. So there's going to be a lot of people, I think, in swing districts kind of doing that calculus, saying, what do the people back home who perhaps are not in my party but voted for me anyway think about this?
Well, I think go ahead.
I wanted to follow up on that point because it's really important, which is that normal voters have a lot more influence in Lansing than they do in Congress. As in, if you call your legislative, your legislator, odds are they're going to get some type of message. And as long as you're not a person who's directly self-interested in an issue, if you're concerned about it, you're going to have a larger voice there. And I think that's one thing that we're going to see going forward is just, lawmakers want to pass popular legislation, and if they hear from their constituents that some things that they're talking about are unpopular, they might reconsider how they vote.
Yeah, and she mentioned the term bipartisanship 7 or 8 times in her State of the State address. So I think people are going to look at that. They've got it recorded, and at the end of this term, they're going to hold her feet to the fire on that and see if that's what she did or she didn't. I mean, so the last big rock that we need to get to in the few minutes we have was the governor's promoting this universal pre-K for all 4-year-olds, free preschool. It's already being offered to 37,000 kids, mostly of lower income. However,
actually, let me
go ahead.
The limits right now on that preschool are $75,000 a year. Like if you earn less than that, you're eligible to receive state support for preschool subsidies. So what they're talking about is paying for preschool of people who can afford to pay for preschool, for everyone who is earning more than $75,000 a year. And yes, childcare is expensive, but is this really the type of benefit that they think they can provide, or that's going to be worth it, of paying for the preschools of a lot of people who can afford it without government assistance?
There we go. It's another case that it's sort of across the board. Yeah. There's a third of Michigan families that probably really desperately need it. Fine.
And
but
they're
the other
already eligible.
2/3,
Yep.
you got to pay. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me either.
Yeah, James said something interesting about COVID and how Congress is weird. And it made me think about just the 3 rounds of checks that went out to people. People who kept their job, making $60,000, $70,000 a year, worked from home, got a check anyway. Like, how do you justify that? This is kind of along the same vein. People who could afford preschool, how do you justify that? People who could afford, who don't really need tax relief compared to the rest of Michigan, get tax relief due to the pension, so-called tax repeal. It's just hard to think about how on economic efficiency grounds or equity grounds you would justify these. Maybe it's political grounds. Universal preschool sounds good politically. Tax relief to seniors sounds good politically. Seniors vote. So you kind of wonder how much of this is being driven by politics rather than, say, sound economic theory.
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear. There are favored groups. Families with children are a favored group. Seniors are a favored group. We want to give some preferences, or lawmakers feel that it's popular to give them preferences, regardless of some basic principles that they should hold. Some basic things like you don't need to take care of people you don't need to take care of. But it's strange on this this universal pre-K, which is how they brand it. Another way of saying it is paying for preschools of people, or paying for the preschools of families who can afford preschool. I don't know why that's more, or why our lawmakers feel that is a popular and important thing to do.
Well, we'll find out when the legislature gets together this week to find out where the rubber hits the road. And on that universal pre-K, there are some concerns and some critics out there. Specifically, you've got people that run preschools, run daycare centers that feel like, oh my goodness, if this went through, I'm out of a job.
Yes, that's certainly one of the unintended consequences for this, especially for daycare providers who would not be eligible because they're not providing the service that is eligible for state subsidies. That's something that I think some people are concerned about, but honestly, like that's a concern. It should be heard. There are some people whose livelihoods are at stake for this one, even though ostensibly there's going to be more money flowing for these services through government that ought to expand it. But you know, I think the basic thing is still like, why are we spending or taxing everyone to give money to already wealthy families?
Right. Got about a minute or so here. Chris had said earlier, with this huge surplus, maybe we should do a one-time thing. Roads, bridges, toll roads. I know you kind of feel like maybe we should reduce the debt a little bit.
Yeah, we accidentally made school employees the state's largest creditors, and this isn't good for teachers or taxpayers alike. There's over $30 billion worth of debt to these households, and paying this down can save billions over time. They did a little bit of that in the most recent budget. We're going to find out whether this is going to be a continued priority for our newfound Democratic majority lawmakers.
All right. Chris, last word on our conversation, not a little bit to how this is going to play out and your thoughts for our viewers, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with what you said about using one-time money for things like roads, bridges, things that benefit all of Michigan, not just selected favored groups. But there's going to be a push to raise revenue for roads. Maybe it's tolls, maybe it's a higher gas tax, higher registration fees. It's going to be a tough sell politically to voters to say, well, you have to pay more for the roads, while at the same time the state has this $9 billion surplus that's going out to special interest groups that's not being used for the roads. So how do you tell voters you got to pay more, but we're not going to use this pot of money for roads?
Right. We'll have to leave that as the last word. James Hohman for the Mackinac Center, Chris Douglas from U of M Flint. You guys made a good team tonight.
All right.
Thanks.
And I think we did have some good perspective looking behind headlines, and we encourage our viewers and constituents, go to MackinacCenter.org. Get some information and
it's Mackinac like the island, not the city.
Absolutely. And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next Tuesday night for the follow-up. The head of the Michigan Chamber of Commerce will be our guest to talk about the current state of our business climate here in Michigan and what's ahead in the coming months. Thanks for joining us tonight. We'll see you next week. Have a great night.